Sorry, Masum people.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The next session is about to begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator for the
Vous allez vous mettre là, ce sera plus simple. Okay, good. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I didn't hear from you. Is it because you haven't had lunch or what is happening? Well, what you're watching in front of you, there's good news and there's bad news. I'll start with bad news. You're watching a less eloquent version of Barack Obama. The good news is it's a version that is a little bit more hopeful about the future of Europe. After all, even Brexit, we can find a way of putting brakes to the exit. Before you, we will be discussing a topic that's a little bit more controversial, sometimes uncomfortable, but at the time such as the one we're facing, sometimes we have to deal with inconvenient truths. Our topic today for this session is going to be fuel to the fire, weaponizing Islam in Europe. Now, for students of history, you must be aware that for about 13 centuries, the dominance of political Islam held a lot of currency. Of course, this came to an end with the fall or the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And for about 100 years, there's been a struggle, especially within the Islamic world or Muslim-dominated lands, on how to establish a legitimate form of government. This struggle has been sometimes what they call voices that are moderate and voices that are extreme. Now, the Arab Spring and the rise of ISIS is testament to the inability to answer this question. Now, the panelists before you are going to help us walk through the contours of political Islam. It has had an effect not just in the Middle East, but actually here in Europe. Increasingly, we have seen political profiteers use the phobia associated with Islam or Islamism for political mobilization. Of course, often with some detrimental results at the ballot box, especially for those who believe in liberal democracy, free speech, and inclusivity. Now, our audience before you, Emmanuel, Abduwari, and Kemadu, they work in this area. They have extensive competence, both in academia and as Islamic scholars. And I encourage that we are going to be as interactive as possible without limiting our ideas or perhaps trying to be diplomatically too careful. Now, I'd like to remind our audience that translating kids right by your chair, it will be a translation from Arabic to English for one of our panelists, and that you can also ask questions using Slido, which if you go to slido.com with the code GLOBSEC 2019, so we can be able to share with our panelists and get appropriate responses. Now, Emmanuel, some people are wondering in this room, the elephant that in the room that is rarely discussed, especially because of political correctness. To what extent is political Islam prevalent in Europe? Is it a threat to European values? Is it so widespread that we need to build bigger walls? What's your opinion? What's your take on that?
Well, I won't be politically correct. That is not how I work. But as an academic, I think it's important to speak precisely of what the question is. Political Islam has always been in the grassroots of Islam. As you all know, the Quran replaces a constitution. And in some cases, a certain number of Muslim states are abiding by that. And there is this uprising again of this will to transform national states and to replace constitution by Sharia. This is the case actually in Sudan, as you are very well aware of, where a certain number of actors are calling for the Sharia to be the new constitution or to pursue the constitution. So the question is whether or not the constitution of modern states, European states, can be compatible with people who accept it or do not accept it. And I think this is the combat or the issue about those who are wanting to instrumentalize politically Islam. I don't like the term political Islam because, again, Islam has always been political. It has always been, has this issue of governing both spiritually and, I must say, on a secular base. But the politicization of Islam, which we are seeing both in Europe and in other countries, is something that interrogates our own system of values. Our constitutions, our, in French we say vivre ensemble, living together capability, are challenged by this because we haven't taken sufficiently in consideration the multiculturalism of our states and of our society. And this is particularly true in France, where we've been a bit stubborn about this issue, not comparing with Great Britain or with other Anglo-Saxon states, but it is, again, an issue. I think, to finish and to be rapid, and hope we'll be rapid and precise on this issue, Islam is not a threat to Europe for a very historical reason. Europe has been living with Islam for 500 years. Al-Andalus Kingdom was a reality in Spain, both in Spain and in the southern shores of Mediterranean. The first diplomatic relation between between Persia, and France, and thus Europe, dates from 1750, 300 years ago. Scholars in French academia, for example, have been studying Arabic for almost 400 years in Collège de France and in Sorbonne. So it's not a new issue. What is new is the fact that it is willing for, well, to rephrase that, some have a political agenda more than a cultural and civilization agenda, and I think this is not a threat, but something we have to address in another way.
Yeah, I'm just curious, why now? Are there forces perhaps behind it? For a very long time we had lived without the threat of political Islam.
Well, there's definitely an agenda, again, and a political agenda with some states using that. Religious diplomacy. Everyone knows that KSA, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, has engaged a certain number of money, a certain number of actions, and taking a certain number of actions on that behalf. There is a momentum in which states are using more and more proxy actors to fulfill this agenda. This is true with Hezbollah, with Iran. This is true maybe with the Muslim Brotherhood, with linked to, of course, historically to Al-Banna, but again, something we can find not only in Egypt, but in all the southern parts of the Mediterranean. So it's a new agenda, again, that we have not been addressing in a correct way. We are addressing it in a security process. We're not trying to understand that the dynamics inside the Muslim society are the same that Europe has experienced 1,000 years ago, between the difference of modernizing Islam or Islamization of modernity. We lived this during the Renaissance period in Europe, when, with the reform, we interrogated what was faith and what was, in Francais we say reason. I don't know if you translate that in English, but you believe or you act. And this is croire ou et gouverner, to govern. So this, I think, has not sufficiently, to repeat myself, been addressed as something that we have experienced in Europe, and which is, I think, now traversing a certain number of societies. This was quite true just after, as a milestone, one of the milestones of the Arab Spring in 2011, and what is happening now in Algeria and Sudan, but I think we could go back on that issue afterwards.
Yeah, Dr. Wario, it's interesting to know what exactly is happening, because we have seen, especially, at least based on the documents that the ISIS has been producing, they tend, or rather at least they claim to extend their caliphate way beyond the Levant. We've seen Boko Haram, we've seen Al-Shabaab on the other end, and parts of the former Soviet Union, we've seen them in Chechnya. What is happening? What is driving? What's the narrative that's driving these groups?
Thank you so much, Chair. I would like to start from the point that when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in a couple of years back declared that he has established a caliphate and self-appointed himself as the first caliph after the fall of the after the fall of the Ottoman Empire during the Second World War, 40,000 people from all over the world turned up to join this caliphate. What does this really mean about the political nature of Muslim communities across the world? But perhaps we need to understand this aspiration among certain constituencies, perhaps even based within Europe, how they vision governance structure should be. So we saw hundreds and hundreds of Europeans from all over turning up to be part of this. The thing that we need to also put into perspective is the nature of the states in which Muslims live, especially outside Europe. This crisis of states. States are not necessarily functioning the way they are. They're not necessarily democratic enough. Or those who live within Europe feel as if they are disenfranchised. They feel probably their cultural aspects are not necessarily captured within the secular system they live in. So they aspire to live in pious system that sorts of appear to, apply the Islamic tenet to the very limit. But of course, behind groups like ISIS, behind groups like Al-Shabaab, behind groups like Al-Qaeda, religion is generally instrumentalized for political end. It's a new form of statecraft that is at play, largely that sits opposite to the neoliberal state that we have across the world. And so when you look at the experience of political Islamism currently, there are a couple of countries perhaps that are experimenting with different form of Islamism, say Turkey or Egypt under Morsi, or some parties, for instance, in Middle East or in Tunisia, like in Nahda and so on. So there is quite diverse expression of what political Islamism is. And it's a mixed bag of success and failure. For instance, in the case of Egypt, for instance, despite the fact that this person was elected on some kind of popular legitimate vote, he couldn't inclusively administer the country enough for it to be considered as one unit. So we see crises continuously also appearing within different experimentation of Islamism. So I could put it that way.
Now we have seen some states have been accused of sponsoring some of these organizations, state sponsors of terror. To what extent, and are there any states that come to mind that perhaps are contributing to the growth and expansion of these groups?
It's a very shady area to actually, put a finger into who could actually be sponsoring states to terrorism. For instance, Sudan has been for a long period associated with the sponsor of state terrorism, and we saw the sanctions that were placed on them for over 20 years because they hosted Al-Qaeda's chief, Osama bin Laden, for a couple of years, and so the sanctions were placed on them. So though these are very political statements that are used by the world powers, especially to sanction states that are affiliated in one way or another with radicalization and terrorism, but Muslim states, Muslim majority states, especially in the Middle East or Turkey and so on, are interested in migrant communities that are living in Europe in one way or another, and they have either support for most communities or associations that continuously look back at home countries as examples from which they could borrow Islamic ideas.
I think Emmanuel would like to...
I don't want to pinpoint precisely the states that you're mentioning, but the ideology that is fueling a certain number of these groups go back to the end of the 80s. And precisely the expansionism, the will to try to convert a certain number of Muslim states who were living under, for example, Sufi legitimacy or Sufi history. I'm thinking of West Africa, have been under pressure by an ongoing and very diplomatic strategy of expansion of Wahhabism, which is a reality. I'm not saying, not pushing on one state, but again, we do know where it has started and how this state is amplifying on that. But that is true, that there has been a certain number of social pressure, a sort of will to use civil society, charities, NGOs, to try to change the narrative. That is, not having a national agenda, but an Ummah agenda, or an agenda coming from abroad. I'm not saying that has fueled a certain number of insurgency, terrorist groups, or irredentist militias, but again, there is a sort of chronology, a link between chronology and that reality.
Now, Kemadu, what is the relationship between I think you'll need your translation kits from Arabic to English. Yeah, so what do you think is the relationship between Islam and political Islam? Are there certain Islamic precepts that perhaps are informing the actions of political Islam or extremist ideology, for instance? Yeah. I was asking if are there any Islamic precepts within the Quran, for instance? Yeah. Are there any Islamic precepts within the Quran that perhaps are informing the actions and the direction of political Islam and extremist ideology? I think a lot of people around the world sometimes wonder whether there's actually a connection inherently between Islam and, for instance, terrorism and extremism.
Translate.
What is the channel? What is the channel?
The channel? Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, it's working now. That's what technology does sometimes. It misbehaves at the most inopportune time. Yeah, the question, Gesame, that you can help us perhaps walk us through is there a relationship between Islam and the rise of political Islam? Is there something inherent within Islam that informs the rise of this ideology and political Islam?
It doesn't work.
Translation.
Normally it should work.
Let's say. Yes, yes. I think as we still work out the technology bit, we're going to move into,
You want me to translate in French? I can translate.
You want to translate in French?
Yeah, repeat and I'll translate in French.
Yes. So, is there anything inherently within Islam that perhaps is informing the actions of terrorist organizations and political Islam? Well, I think we'll come back to that later. Now, our next question goes to Emmanuel. Emmanuel?
Huh? Don't speak in the microphone, just listen.
Yeah.
Just listen. Comment vous analysez?
Yeah, I think we can proceed now, and we're going to sort that out later. So,
أيوة الإسلام السلام عليكم. الإسلام دين متكامل ونحن في القرن الرابع عشر للإسلام من بداية الإسلام إلى يومنا هذا، وهذا وقت طويل في حياة الأمم وليس بقريب على كل حال. فالإسلام كانت هناك دول ودول سقطت، والآن نحن اليوم في تحول آخر في مجال العالم كله. ما يأتي للإسلام يأتي لجميع الأديان ويأتي لجميع الشعوب. أما ما يقوله على أن الإسلام هل يمكن أن يساير هذا الزمن، فهذا أنا أقول له شيء بأكيد، لأن الإسلام ساير الأوقات كلها إلى يومنا هذا ولم نجد فيه أي تحريف. لكن الذي حدث في القريب تقريبا في نهاية القرن الماضي إلى هذا القرن الذي نعيشه حاليا تحول من الإرهاب وما إلى ذلك. كل هذا الإسلام ليس له علاقة بهذه الأمور كلها. فمجرمون يقومون بأعمال لا صلة لها بالدين، ثم نأتي نقول الإسلاميين أو الإسلاميون. كل هذا اتهام على الإسلام ولا مبرر لها. الإسلام الذي نعرفه إسلام متسامح وعاشت ما لا يقل عن 14 قرن يساير الزمن، وليس هناك حرب بين الإسلام وبين أي دولة أخرى. هذا ما شاهدناه وهذا ما تعلمناه في الماضي. فإننا الإسلام في كل البلاد التي أعرفها متساير. أما ما حدث في بداية هذا القرن هذا لا نستطيع أن نسميه بأن هذا هو الإسلام على كل حال، ويجب أن نبعد ذلك عن الإسلام ولا نقول أن هذا هو الإسلام. الإسلام دين، وهذا الدين ناس يتدينون به في كل مكان ويتعايشون مع غيرهم. ونحن في فرنسا عندنا ما نسميه بمؤتمر أئمة فرنسا. هذا المؤتمر يقوم بأعمال كبيرة جدا لتفهيم الناس أن ما يجري من أعمال من العنف الإسلام بريء عنه على كل حال، وهذا ما يجب أن نفهمه في كل مكان ما نحن فيه.
But you say that it has nothing to do with Islam, and yet these groups claim to do it in the name of Islam. Now, how can you convince the rest of the world that it's not Islamic?
كيف ممكن تشرحون للناس لأن الناس يقومون بعمل الإرهاب؟
إجرامات في الدنيا دائما يحاول أن يوصله بشيء آخر، لكن الدين الإسلامي كما قلت لا علاقة له بالإرهاب الذي نشاهده في كل مكان. فإنما يقوم إنسان مسجون في السجون سنوات عديدة ويخرج من السجن ويقوم بإجرام من الإجرامات سواء كان مسيحيا أو يهوديا أو مسلما، فهل يعني ذلك أن هذا الشخص الذي قام بهذا الإجرام في مكان أن نسمي بأنه على أنه كان مسلما يجب أن يكون ذلك هو عمل الإسلامي؟ طبعا لا، نحن لا نقبل ذلك. نحن نعرف بالتأكيد أن الإسلام دين متسامح، ودين عمل طوال العقود أو القرون الماضية لإسعاد البشرية، وهذا ما نحن فيه. نحن في فرنسا قمنا بأعمال كثيرة بقافلات لإعلام الناس على أن ما يجري في العالم حاليا ليس من عمل الإسلام، والإسلام لا يقبله بحال من الأحوال، وهذا ما نجده الأئمة يدعون بها في كل مكان. فمن هنا ومن هنا نجد الناس إرهابيين يقومون بأعمال دنيئة ويريدون أن ينسبوه إلى الإسلام. ومن السهل جدا أن نقول أنهم مسلمون، صحيح، جماعة يبيعون المخدرات، جماعة يعملون بالإجرامات، وإجراماتهم كيف ننسب هذا إلى الإسلام؟ الإسلام لا يقبل هذا. يجب أن يكون الشيء الذي يتعلق بالإسلام منسوب إلى أناس لهم اليد على الإسلام بالذات. مفتيين، أناس مسؤولين، أناس جمعيات مثلا، هيئات كبيرة، وهذا وهذا غير موجود. فلم نسمع بذلك أبدا أن هيئات مثل الأزهر دعا إلى الإرهاب، أو هيئات مثل جامعة مدينة المنورة دعا إلى الإرهاب، لا. هؤلاء كلهم يدافعون عن الإسلام ولا يريدون أن يقوم. فكيف نستطيع أن نسند عمل إنسان مجرم موجود في السجن أن نسمي عمله بأنه هو على أنه مسلم فقط؟ يجب أن نسند هذا العمل إلى الإسلام. هذا نحن نرفضه، ونرفضه في كل مكان. ليس ذلك بإسلام، فالإسلام دين متسامح.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank Emmanuel for the translating, in French for us. But I have a question for you, Emmanuel. We've seen what is happening increasingly in Europe. You have a lot of young men and women crossing over to go to the Middle East, to fight in jihad or for whatever cause they think. What are we doing in Europe to make sure that we actually reduce this problem of extremist recruiting from home? You find decent kids who have access to education, come from middle-class families, but they still find themselves in there, and then it becomes problematic for us to get them back because we don't know exactly what we're dealing with. What do you think Europe should do to make sure that this problem does not continue?
Well, first of all, it's not a problem only that Europe has to tackle. There approximately was 5,000 foreign fighters who went to Syria coming from Europe, about the same coming from the Middle East, well, North Africa and Middle East. And it is a matter of concern for the African Union, as Mohamed Faki, the president of the Commission of the African Union, mentioned it frequently. So it's not only a problem about Europe. Secondly, I think the problem is not saying that they go to Syria or they went to Syria or to Iraq, more recently to Libya, and more anciently in Afghanistan for social reasons, because they're not integrated and because Europe has not mentioned or has not managed to integrate all of the communities. I do prefer communities more than ethnies. There is no ethnies in France. There is no community, by the way, but that's another question. So the issue, I think, I wanted to raise that after the intervention of a colleague, because a certain number of European countries, not to say United States, have, I think, thought in the outskirts of the Arab Springs that political Islam was the worst solution, because they were fearing that if they were not sustaining, or they would not sustain political Islam parties, and this is quite true in Tunisia, with the rise of Ennahda, as you know, Hanouchi made his studies in Great Britain and has a certain number of contacts with American scholars in NYU and in Fordham University in New York. I think a certain number of countries, and again, I will speak more precisely on my country, I thought that sustaining political Islam was a solution in order to prevent the state to go and to shift to violent extremism. I'm not saying we made a mistake on that, but again, this was the narrative between 2010 and 2011. And this was a narrative, by the way, with a certain number of Maghreb countries. For example, when there was a change of constitution in Morocco in 2011, which saw the rise of the PGD, the Justice and Democratic Party, the Development Party, which is still in power, that was one of the responses that the king, Mohammed VI, thought was convenient. Not the same response in Algeria, when the FIS and now the MSP were pushed aside, even though they won the election in 1991. So I think this is very important to address maybe your question, saying it's not about Islam, it's about political agenda again. People went in Syria not based on the fact that they were doing a jihad, but based on the fact that they were pushing again for a geopolitical agenda, and this is quite true, maybe truer maybe in Libya, where there is absolutely no religious essence in the fact that Daesh is recoming to, even though it has been pushed already in 2016 in the Libyan shores. So political agenda. Then there's the geopolitical agenda. We already mentioned that. Based on the fact that now I see coming a new political agenda. We are now in the post-revolutionary stance. Morsi is no longer in power in Egypt. So the Brotherhood was put aside, Muslim Brotherhood was put aside in Egypt. Ennahda, even though is not in power, but still represents 40% of the electoral votes in Tunisia, which is important because, as you all know, Hanouchi, its chief, has said 3 days ago that he will be running for the presidency by the end of the year. And in Algeria, and maybe more in Sudan, we see that this is, again, becoming more and more an agenda. The people who went on the streets were saying 3 things: liberty, civil rights, no Sharia. We don't want Sisi, and we don't want external ingerence, external interferences. This is exactly what happened again in Mali. And again, maybe I can address and respond precisely to your question. How do we address the fact that a certain number of born French, went to fight in Syria and Libya? Well, first of all, we have to address the fact that a certain number of French citizens have not had the impression that they were equal to rights and didn't have the same access to what the Republic was giving them. Maybe to be preciser on this, there is no statistic, no religious, no ethnic statistic in France. So we don't know precisely who is Muslim and who is not Muslim. It would be discriminatory to say you are Muslim because you come from Algeria. They may not be Muslim. They may not be practitioner. We think that only 6% of the French population is linked to Islam by history and not by practice of religion. So that would make more or less something like 6 to 7 million Muslims in France. They are French nationality, but practicing Islam. But amongst these 6 million, only 1.5 million are believers and practitioners of the religion. So again, pushing aside the religious aspects. And I think one of the comparison which is accurate is saying that in some cases, religion, not saying Islam, religion can be a sort of replacement of what the state does not do. We have the phenomenon of center and periphery. All of these terrorists, irredentists, militias, guerrilla groups grow in areas very far from the administrative centers of this country. That means that the state has withdrawn. And when the state withdrawn, it happened in 1950s in Italy, in Sicilia, when someone replaces that. criminal organization. I think we have to link that not to religion, but to the fact that when the state is not there, you have someone willing to push aside the state and replace it, offer justice, offer work capability, and of course, offer a political future. So I'm not sure I respond to your question, but I think this is important to have in mind.
Thank you. I was just wondering, we know how religionization of politics and politicization of religion, what it can do, especially with regard to coexistence and harmony. Now, in the light of what is happening today in our current world, we also understand that, especially those who practice in the field of countering violent extremism, that moderate voices are very important in the fight against extremism. Now, from your experience, what do you think Europe should do, especially in empowering moderate voices, especially of the Islamic leaders? And are they even doing enough? Are Islamic leaders actually doing enough to fight back against the terrorist narrative?
I will borrow some examples from Africa, in this case, Kenya's case. Kenya neighbors Somalia, and Somalia has been a failed state since 1991. And by 2005, the warlords, Islamic State Court Union had taken over. Al-Shabaab rose in this power vacuum that my colleague has also discussed. When the state is no longer working well, especially in these parts of the world, chances of individuals ganging up and instrumentalizing religion for purpose of building a new form of state polity is extremely possible. Now the question now rises to issues of moderate leaders. There's been experimentation across the world, for instance, of voices that are alternative to the ones of say, Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. One of the biggest crises that faces these forms of voices is legitimacy. Are they individuals that are considered considerably across the swath of Europe as individuals who can give directions that will be followed by the youth? When youth, especially young people, take positions that are contrary to those of both the state in which they live and the religious leaders that lead their communities, they are often inclined not to listen to this kind of moderation. But by and large, despite the fact that these voices might not be listened to, they need to be supported. The experience, for instance, from Kenya is, and East Africa is that when these campaigns that are usually called counter-violent extremism involves the communities better, chances of this agenda being accepted across by many stakeholders is strong. So if their legitimacy is good enough, if they are authoritative enough to give directions within their societies, if they do not also engage in exclusion of other voices within their own circles, perfect. But getting such groups of individuals is something that needs to be nurtured within individual countries rather than across Europe. Because, say, someone could enjoy extreme position of authority, say in Netherlands or in Germany or in France, and these voices need to be nurtured as country-specific voices that are going to guide communities towards the path of moderation and fighting violent extremism. In addition, whether it is real or not, those perceived grievances that individuals cite as reasons for going to join violent extremist group must be addressed by the society and must involve much more of communities themselves than state security agencies or any other partner that is seen as alien by these communities. And I think to finalize, examples need to be borrowed within Europe, and people need to learn from each other's experience on how to address this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that contribution. Perhaps 30 seconds.
I wanted to address that in another way. The problem we have concerning the intermediate forces, what we call in French l'Islam des Lumières, moderate Islam, is just a question of institution. There is no such thing as clericalism in Sunnism. Mm-hmm. So who is legitimate and who is not legitimate? Yeah. Is the rector of Al-Azhar, the oldest university in the world, in Muslim world, 1053, created the same day as Cairo was created, is he legitimate? In the new Egyptian constitution, he has the rank of prime minister. So he is institutionally legitimate, not only for Egypt, but a certain number of Sunni. Now the question is also can be raised with the King of Morocco, because the King of Morocco is the commander of the faithful. Again, he has a legitimacy not only in as king of the Sherifian, with a certain number of
Yes.
political and historical legitimacy coming from Morocco and having spread.
السؤال هو ممكن يكون في فرنسا، ونوضع السؤال: من هو المسؤول الأول؟ هل أنتم الذين عندكم مساجد وتذهبون إلى المساجد، أو عندكم مسؤولية في جانب معين فقط؟ من المسؤول عن ذلك؟ أو لأن عندكم فقط ألقاب أكاديمية؟ نحن جبنا على هذا السؤال باتجاه آخر. الذي عنده مسجد وعنده أشخاص داخل المساجد هو المسؤول، ولكن نحن كنا خاطئين. البداية أينما مفروض أن نعمل، اللي مفروض أن نعمل فيه أمام القادة المسلمين أو قادة المؤمنين الآخرين. منذ يجب أن نعمل على أجندة واحدة أينما تتكلم جميع الديانات في مكان واحد، والتعامل مع أيضا الدول الأخرى ما فيها المسلمة، حتى نعمل على تكوين مكون واحد ما بين المنظمات أو الديانات عامة، وليس الإسلام فقط. ممكن في هذه الحالة سنطرح المكان العامل لوضع الأسئلة للمشاركين في البانل. أنا عندي سؤال إلى السيد إيمانويل. تكلمنا عن من هو المسؤول في الجانب الديني. ممكن أسألك سيد إيمانويل، كيف تعمل بكلمة إسلاموفوبيا أو ضد الإسلام؟ هل هذه الكلمة مناسبة؟ هل نحن لا يمكن أن هي قومية أو إثنيك؟ كيف ممكن أن نتعامل مع هذا المصطلح ضد الإسلام؟ سؤال آخر. ممكن أن نسأل سؤال آخر أيضا؟ معك حق. دائما نحن نستخدم كلمة مرتبطة بالإسلام. بالفعل هناك في الشرق أيضا ديانات أخرى بما فيها المسيحية واليهودية. السياسيين لم يستطيعوا وضع سؤال أو موضوع معين لحل مثل هذه الإشكالية. هذا تكلمنا عن فرنسا. نتكلم عن المسلمين الذين في فرنسا الذين أتوا من دول ليست مسلمة فقط، فيها إسلام ومسيحيين، وهناك عندنا أقلية تتكلم بأنهم مسلمين، ما فيهم الجزائريين تونسيين، ويقولوا عن أنفسهم أنهم مسلمون. كما نناضل مثلا في كفاح ضد الإرهاب وضد التطرف اليميني لا، هذا ليس تمييز عنصري، ولكن أيضا ممكن نسميها مصطلح إسلاموفوبيا أو الخوف من الإسلام. ذكرت بأن هناك في سبب بأن الإسلام لا يمكن يكون جوهر لجمع الثقافات أو الجمع اللاثنيات. هناك
another one. I think we're not sufficiently addressing the issue of the change of the sociology of our societies. No society no longer is unicultural. Each society, everywhere in the world, is multicultural. So this is a question that the politicians should address when speaking to a certain people, a certain category of people do not feel sufficiently French. Then there is the question of reciprocity. We are not interfering in the political or religious affairs of some countries. And one of the reasons why there is this form of racism, this form of antagonism with the Muslim, is because a certain number of countries are using that open door, this back door, to have an agenda. Both Turkey and Algeria in France, which are running the most mosques, Marseille for Turkey, and Paris, the oldest mosque in Paris, 1924, the Grande Mosquée de Paris. So this is very important. This is how France, for example, is addressing the question, saying that when it comes to the creation of Islam de France, there's two pillars on that. Organizational, as I mentioned, we need someone to speak with, and of course the question of the capacity of having Republic and Islam being totally compatible. Quran cannot reform or cannot replace a constitution or a citizenship. That is what I call reciprocity.
Thank you. Now, if in fact working with moderate voices can advance the cause of addressing extremism, how are we supporting moderate voices, especially Islamic voices in Europe, to ensure, especially in the light of increased Islamophobia in some countries, to ensure that we can co-opt them into the process of countering violent extremism and terrorist ideology?
Well, there's 2 or 3 questions inside your interrogation. First question, how can we address better? We're already addressing the moderate voices, as for example, to bring them to power. It's again a problem of sort of medium range. And I think this opens to another question that we've been pinpointing all during our debates. The question between the opposition between Shia, for example, and Sunnism is not about religion. It's based on the fact that a certain number of countries, let's speak about the 90 million inhabitants of Iran, have gone to revolution in 1979, where all of the other Sunni countries, except Iraq, except Syria, we know what happened with Syria and what happened with Iraq, are not monarchies. They are republics. We may not like the leadership of one or the other. We choose to change the regime of the both, but I think this is an important point. It's again based on the fact that when you want to address this issue that the former president of Tunisia, Monsef Marzouki, addressed very well when he won the election in 2013. He wanted to modernize Islam and not Islamize modernity, which is something quite true because that is a political agenda. The other one is just taking consideration that we're living in a century where actors are changing, people are reassuming the fact that they want to have community building. I'm not saying this. Francis Fukuyama is saying this in his last essay, saying, I was wrong 30 years ago, saying that it was the end of history, last man, end of history, saying it is the return of ethics, it is the return of community, but it is, in a way, a sort of democratic regression.
I would like to take another set of questions from the audience. Make it brief, perhaps 10 seconds, please.
My name is Alexandra Wojek. I am a publicist, and I have a question to the professor from Al-Azhar. How do you think, from your perspective, how Al-Azhar and you as a professor, as a lecturer, can support moderate Muslims?
French.
نحن أولا
Before I answer the question, I'd like to thank to the French government. I've been to France for around 35 years. And then problems appeared. Problems caused by people who have nothing to do with Islam and have no culture of Islam. They only know they're Muslims. People who came from Orient, from the East, people who came to the peaceful country and they say they're Muslims and they want to realize processes or perform processes which are very harsh, and they say it's in compliance with Islam. It's enough if someone labels someone else that he or she is a thief and they start to execute their plans. They say it's against Islam. Just like it happened on the 11th of September in the United States, I don't want to return to history too much. Despite the fact, what was done in New York, those people, they said they were Muslims, but not all the Muslims are like that. Some Muslims want to cover this. They want to cover these terrible deeds with the color of Islam. It is necessary to differentiate between Islam and terrible acts, criminal acts, which some individuals commit. Just like they've done in some parts of France or other parts of the world. As an example, what happened in Charlie Hebdo, for example. We attempted in France to combat terrorism. We wanted to combat extremism. Islamic religion is innocent. These people say they're Muslims. But it's not acceptable to blame Islam as a whole for this crime, because these crimes have been committed by criminals. I believe that all Muslims who feel to be part of Islam, they feel to be Muslim, they are peaceful, feel to be part of this peaceful Islam. I would say 95% of Muslims in Senegal, for example, no one ever heard that these people would be terrorists or extremists, for example. They execute their religious deeds in a peaceful way. They practice their religion in a peaceful way. And what is happening in Nigeria is very far from Islam.
I'd like to apologize for some translation problems somewhere at the beginning. And thank you very much for staying with us, and thanks for the panelists. I would like to ask that you stay for our next session, which will start very shortly, and it's going to be on hybrid threats to our security, to start in about a minute or so. So please stay in your chairs, stay comfortably in your seats, and let's wait for the next moderator and the next set of panelists. Thank you very much.
Good morning. So I can't remember, what is it, Dobry wieczór? Anyhow, good afternoon, and thanks very much for being here. I'm Frank Gardner. I'm the BBC security correspondent. So I've been covering international security since 2002. I'm in a wheelchair because I got shot by terrorists in 2004 on June the 6th. So today is my alive day. I'm very happy to still be alive and be with you here. It's my second visit to Bratislava, and I'm delighted to be back in this beautiful historic city. We've got a good panel today. And before I introduce them, I'm just going to kind of tell you the format of today, which is that we're going to keep this very relaxed, very informal, and quite dynamic and fast-flowing. So there'll be no big, long speeches by anybody. I'm particularly interested in your questions, and I'm sure you all know how to use the Slido. You just go to slido.com, submit your questions, and hopefully we will get time to cover them. So to introduce the panel, the first one on my left here is an incredibly important man. He is the Director General of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. This is the international watchdog that tries to prevent the proliferation of chemical weapons, poison gas, around the world. So very, very important job at this time. Daniel Milo is from GlobSec and is going to talk very much about hybrid threats. Next to him is John Abel from Oracle, who is going to focus on data, which is more exciting than it sounds. And next to him is Cyril Shiva from MSD, which is the European partner to Merck in the United States, the healthcare industry. I'm going to start with you, Daniel. If you can just explain briefly to our audience, what do we mean by hybrid threats or hybrid warfare?
I think the term hybrid threats is very fitting to the title of this panel, Cloak and Dagger, because indeed cloak and dagger tactics have always been used in international relations. However, the means and the technology used is changing rapidly, and the term hybrid threats actually means a mixture of coercive and subversive activities used in a coordinated manner by state and non-state actors to influence decision-making processes and to subvert specific societies or to influence undue pressure on particular actors.
Right, let me stop you there. It sounds like you've memorized this by heart.
Kind of.
Can you give an example, or a recent, something that's been in the news that we'll all have heard of hybrid warfare or hybrid threat?
Well, one particular example would be the use of Novichok attack in the Skripal case in the UK, because it involves a use of chemical agent, chemical weapon actually in the UK by state actor. I think we all know that who was behind such attack, thanks to the investigation by the UK authorities. And the purpose was also very clear. This attack was intended to send the message to Sergei Skripal, and to punish him for speaking to UK authorities and to deter others from doing the same.
That segues us neatly, actually, into Fernando Arias here. I'm sorry, I didn't give your title, your name, rather, but as head of the OPCW, what keeps you awake at night? If you could give a decent answer, not an obscene one.
Thank you for this question. After what happened in the airport in Kuala Lumpur in 2017 and in 2018 in Salisbury and Amesbury, we realized that we have new and very dangerous threats. The organization, I work in an organization called the Opcw, as Mr. Garden said. 22 years of work of the organization has meant that 76% of the most dangerous chemicals of the world, declared chemical weapons by the 193 member states, have been destroyed. We thought it was a great success, and it is. But we realized that because of the progress of science and technology, new chemicals, as the Novichok that was mentioned a few seconds before, are there. And we are aware that with milligrams, I repeat, milligrams of some chemicals, VX, Novichok family, it's a very big family.
It's a nerve agent.
It's a nerve agent, and with milligrams, all the people who are in this room can be killed in the matter of seconds, easily. And the challenge of this organization, the OPCW I worked for, is to establish controls, to carry out inspections, investigations, to prevent, to create awareness of the very new and very dangerous challenges we have to face at the moment.
So if I could just come back to my question, what's coming down the track that we need to worry about? Is it terrorists getting hold of a nerve gas? as they did in Tokyo in 1995 on Shinriko with sarin? Is it states developing new offensive chemical weapons? Is it biological weapons? What worries you most?
The combination of biological and chemical is something new, and it is an emerging real threat. For preparing for manufacturing some of the most dangerous chemicals, we need the precursors. They are established perfectly in 3 lists, Schedule 1, 2, and 3. But it is demonstrated that nowadays, with the help of biology, some very, very dangerous chemicals can be produced without those chemical precursors on the basis of biology. The goal of this organization I worked for is to be a depository of knowledge, expertise, skills to serve the international community, because the goal of this organization is to protect the international community. It is almost an universal organization, 193 members. The universality has not been reached because still we have 4 countries that are not members. But we can think...
I think we should name and shame those 4 countries that refuse to join. Who are they?
Well, I respect all the countries in the world. The countries that are not members are Egypt, Israel. Israel has signed the treaty, the convention, but has not ratified it. Sudan and North Korea. And we are working to convince them. We invite Israel. Israel takes part in many activities of the organization. They are very active. They like very much to come. They have not decided yet to be a member. To be a member means that they have to declare all the chemical weapons they have. And the declaration is under inspection. The principle of trust but verify in disarmament is implemented in this organization. But this organization has something which is very different to the nuclear field. In this organization, on a legal basis, 193 countries have committed themselves not only to destroy all the chemical weapons in the world, but to prevent the re-emergence of them, which means tolerance zero. In the nuclear, as you see, as you know, perhaps much better than I do, we speak about no proliferation, because we have to be realistic, and there are countries that have nuclear weapons and they want to keep them, and there is no way for the time being. Yeah. But in the chemical field, tolerance zero. The chemical weapons are forbidden all over the world forever, and we have to be very tough to defend this principle.
We're going to come back to chemical weapons because it's one of those kind of horror subjects that I'm afraid both fascinates and terrifies people, but we're going to come back to this. John, if I could turn to you, in terms of data and cyber intrusion, what do you see as the biggest threats to our society?
I suppose the first one is actually naivety. You know, data is everywhere. Everybody has data. They have old data, new data, and data they don't know about yet. But what we do know is it's getting to a scale where the human can't manage it anymore. You know, the human is struggling to manage it. But what we find in a lot of industry statistics is the basics of managing data. You know, when you hear that most security breaches are due to a vulnerability that was known about in the past, where someone hadn't actually applied the patch that was freely available from that vendor. So, you know, it's being aware of your data value. You know, if you went to any boardroom in the world and said, what's your biggest asset? It will probably be the use of data today. You know, no company can really operate efficiently without secure and safe data. So I worry about just the basics. Just manage it carefully, know what you're doing. And that's probably where you need to start.
I saw a statistic recently that a new piece of malware comes onto the internet approximately every 2 to 3 seconds. Now, that statistic was given to me about 18 months ago, so it's probably even faster than that. The other statistic I was given was that on average, it takes a company 140 days to patch up a cyber breach intrusion. Does that sound realistic?
Yeah, I mean, 140 days sounds actually quite short. What happens in most customers is when a system gets into a productional state, the people don't want to touch it. there is an air of caution, and we need to move into, and a lot of companies are dealing with this now, because there are good policies like GDPR, and I know one of the conversations earlier this morning was about GDPR. I'm favourable of GDPR because it brings in...
Just explain briefly, what is GDPR?
So it's personal identifiable information. It's basically, actually it started before GDPR. We started with PCI compliance, which was basically credit number, credit card holding. Retailers had to comply with that. And now we've got a wider established concept around the personal identifiable data. What it is it's just good industry practice. You know, it's about applying good practice, things that aren't radically going to change your organization. One stat that I did find recently, I was at a call center conference and I was doing some research for it. If you get it wrong, it was quite an interesting stat that 80% of people will not give their data, this PII data, to companies that had data breaches. So
in other words, people feel that they've been bitten by this and they don't trust giving over their...
Correct.
I mean, I can understand that. Switching slightly, 2 years ago, I was at the Emirates Literary Festival in Dubai, and somebody asked me a question, what did I think of fake news? And you know, I said, look, I think it's one of these kind of fads. It's the kind of term of the year, but probably we won't be discussing it a year from now. And I was so wrong. So 2 years on, fake news is bigger than ever before. We have a department in the BBC that tries to address fake news because it's become critical to us, to our credibility in BBC as a media organization, that we both counter fake news and that we're not accused of it ourselves. So we have fact checkers who work, you know, non-stop 24/7. One industry that I think is where this is particularly vulnerable is healthcare. So Cyril, what do you see as the threats of fake news in your area?
So, I mean, the threats in terms of healthcare, the WHO, so the World Health Organization, has identified 10 different threats to health security. Among these, you have climate change, antimicrobial resistance, Ebola, and also vaccines hesitancy. And if we think of vaccines hesitancy, I mean, this is where fake news are playing a major role.
Just to explain, vaccine hesitancy, this is people who say, oh, I'm not sure I want to have the inoculation.
So that's the fact that people would not get their children or themselves vaccinated. And we're seeing, a resurgence in terms of a number of diseases. And we've had recently an important measles outbreak going on at the moment, in fact, in quite a few countries, that largely are due to fake news and to people losing confidence in vaccines. And we're seeing, in fact, that fake news, within healthcare, the first area where fake news focus is on vaccines. There's a lot of emotions around vaccines. And if you take a bit of a step back, even when countries have an extremely well-structured immunization program, if the confidence is lost, the level of immunization reduces. And we're seeing many countries where they have a great system of immunization, but they're not achieving to eliminate preventable diseases.
So I remember that not that long ago there was a conspiracy theory in parts of Pakistan that the vaccination program, I think to eliminate polio, was rumored to be a CIA plot to try and sterilize the people of Pakistan or something, some nonsense theory. What I think was more shocking to me was to hear that here in Europe there are these conspiracy theories. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, I don't really want to have it, but I'm not sure why. It's another to actually find that in Romania, I think, there are these theories that the vaccination causes, I don't know, all sorts of things that it doesn't.
Well, if you look at a few numbers, a few statistics, on average, 15% of the population is hesitant, believes that vaccines are not safe. This can go up to 40% in countries even where I come from, in France. And there's a number of things that explain hesitancy. You have the confidence in the vaccines itself, safety, efficacy, including also the confidence in the healthcare professionals that deliver the vaccines, and the policymakers. you have an element of convenience. Is it complicated or not to get to the vaccine? And we know that in some geographies, there's a lot of complexity. And then there's an element of complacency, which is, you know, we tend to forget that there is a risk, because these are diseases that, especially in Europe, many of them we're not seeing anymore. And there's an element of forgetting that it's not only about protecting myself, it's also about protecting the community around me. So that's why we're seeing, for example, with measles, such outbreaks. If you look just in Europe last year, 80,000 cases in the country, 25% of them leading to hospitalizations, plus sometimes some consequences over a lifetime, and close to 1,000 people died. So of a disease that is totally preventable.
So let's talk about the weaponization of health risks. Some time ago, I read a really chilling book, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Director General, called Biozone. It was by somebody called Ken Alibek. He was a Kazakh Soviet scientist. His real name was Alibekov. And he ran something called Biopreparat. Biopreparat was the Soviet Union's biological weapons program, which it ran right up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. After the dissolution of the USSR, there was a defanging, a dismantling of the Soviet Union's biological weapons program, where they'd been conducting tests with monkeys and the RLC on Rebirth Island. And let's not forget that Western countries had offensive chemical and biological weapons programs. Britain up until the 1950s, America, I think, later. As head of the OPCW, are you confident that big state weapons programs in chemical and biological weapons are a thing of the past?
I cannot speak about biological. In the field of chemicals, the only thing that is remaining is the 4%, 3.6% not yet destroyed, which is in the United States, and they are destroying it in Colorado and in Kentucky. They will finish in 3.5 years, more or less, and 100% of the declared chemical weapons will be destroyed.
But it's the undeclared ones that worry us, presumably.
Well, then, in connection with that, I want to tell you something that was mentioned before, the fake news. In the field of chemicals, we can have the fake news that can undermine the organization, that can undermine the instruments of investigation and the inspection of the organization. But we can also have the no news or no information, or the over-information, which is as bad as the fake news. Why? Fake news undermine, they manipulate people. No information creates a non-awareness. But in the field of chemicals, too much information, which is what is happening on the internet, is a real risk. In the web, and even worse, in the deep web, we can find information for made it yourself, explaining in detail where can you find chemicals, how to process them, where can you find equipment in the open market, and they teach you how to use this equipment to produce very dangerous chemicals, which means that no information is very bad. But too much information, and in this case, it is extremely dangerous, because any non-state actor, and we have to start from the principle that this world is full of non-controlled money. And with this money and the knowledge, the information given in internet, very dangerous chemicals can be produced, and they can be used for malicious purposes. Guarantee of declaration of the declarations made by the member states. You have to consider that I am a kind of manager in this organization, and I worked for 193 countries on an equal basis, as we were commenting before. I'm not suspicious of anyone. They made the declarations, they accept the inspections, and the inspections have focused in the chemical industry for avoiding the dual use, but also in the destruction. All the destruction has been under supervision of the organization. And we never find a single problem in 22 years of task. This is what I can tell you.
Okay. John, you deal with information, and you have to cope with fake news, etc. Do you think the internet should be better regulated to stop the kind of things that Director General is talking about here? The fact that if you know where to look on the dark web, on the Onion right or whatever, you can find some really nasty recipes for bad things.
The challenge of the world is if you look at a lot of technology, the technology comes first, the regulation comes second. Because once something goes from a minimum viable product, that's an early state, and a seed, and then grows into something. Then you've got to worry. Once you realise that it's growing to, you've got to regulate what's now got bigger, and it's like then you're going back over history to try and change. You know, I've got 4 daughters, and I say to them, you're creating a digital footprint everywhere you go in posting pictures, in imaging, and my view at the moment is there's 2 elements. One, we've got to educate society of the digital world we now live, so they're aware of their footprint, they're aware of the eco-environment they work in, because there's a little bit of accountability on the person. And the second one is you've got to balance regulatory with innovation. If you over-regulate, you will starve innovation. If you under-regulate, then you will create obviously more breaches and more issues. So it's a complex area, and every industry is slightly different. In a well-regulated industry like healthcare or financial services or atomic weapons versus retail, or it may just be social posting on your favorite website. And it's a very complex eco-environment we live in.
Okay, well, on regulation, I'm going to turn to the first question that's in the Slido here, and this is for Cyril, I think. And do start sending in your answers, your questions, rather. Well, you can send in the answers too if you want. So the question, and this comes from Anonymous, you know, if you've got nothing to hide, please don't put Anonymous, but say who you are. You know, you're not going to go to jail. What are some examples of fake news regarding vaccines? Who is responsible for correcting the disinformation? Is it physicians or is it the government? It's a good question.
It's a good question. So examples, there's so many examples that play to the fears, to the emotions, to obviously the side effects, to so you know, we could go on. In terms of how to handle these, I think it's not a question of one solution. The first way I see it, and when we talk about prevention, it's about preventing in terms of information. So I believe that we need to have a continuous flow of information from scientific society, governments, as well as industry, to the public using social media, because this is where the information is. And I believe it's about prevention and education. I mean, we're at a time where if we just only react once the news is there, it's very often too late. Although, and I have several examples there are many initiatives that are undertaken by the large providers like Twitter, Google, Facebook to try and better regulate what they recognize is becoming an issue. I mean, as an example, when you do a search on Twitter in the UK on vaccines, you're being proposed to go on a site of NHS to get facts on vaccination. So that's, I would say, a proactive, positive education.
The NHS is the National Health Service.
National Health Services in Great Britain. So I think we need to think a little bit more of having a digital coalition where we continuously bring the right facts and information to.
But who would run it?
It's not about who would run it in terms of having to run it. It's each party, I would say, each stakeholder taking their responsibilities, whether you have scientific societies, and they increasingly do it. Governments, ministries of health increasingly do it. Historically, they've done it in a more traditional manner, but they've started to have actions on the net. One that I just mentioned, but there are many others. So it's ourselves in trying to provide the most adequate patient-friendly information within our regulation.
Daniel, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just want to point to an interesting dynamism between the medical hoaxes and disinformation and the ones that I would call are geopolitical ones, or the conspiracy theories. Because if you really look at this issue from a broader perspective, what you would see is that those medical disinformation or conspiracy theories, to maybe call them more precisely, serve as a gateway to a complete parallel universe of conspiracy theories. And a person could start from, asking, is a vaccination good for my child? And a couple of weeks later, he or she might find themselves in a bizarre world full of dark pharmaceutical companies who try to run the world, or Jewish occupation government, and so on and so forth. And you would be really surprised how widespread and how interconnected such a view could become. Just to give you a very recent example, last year we did at GlobSec a representative opinion poll looking into trust into different kinds of conspiracy theories in this very region. And you would not expect that in a country where we are based, in Slovakia, half of the population actually believes that Jews have too much power and they secretly run the governments in the world. Half of the population. 40% believe that Americans brought down the Twin Towers on their own. So it was an inside job. And as you can see, this erosion of trust, this erosion of trust in rational arguments, in facts, this is something as a kind of a undercurrent that connects the conspiracy theories regarding, say, vaccination, or geopolitical issues, or contemporary issues. I don't know, the Salisbury attack is also a very good example of that. Yeah. There have been so many different theories trying to shift the blame from the Russians to anyone else, but not.
Then you're touching on, I think we're touching on education there.
Yes. I mean, I'm going to come back to this if there's time, but I'm going to throw this open to the audience now, and I think the first question is to a minister from the Czech Republic. You have a question, sir?
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon. It's basically not a question, it's a comment on vaccine hesitancy. Because you know definitely that vaccine hesitancy is there since the very beginning, since discovery of vaccines. But we know that vaccines have a huge added value. They are able to prevent many diseases. But what's happening, those vaccine preventable diseases are disappearing. But there is no one vaccine 100% effective, 100% safe. So we still have certain side effects. And if the diseases are disappearing from the public, so we have just side effects. And many people argue, okay, we should stop immunization just to avoid those side effects. But it's nonsense. And we are just now in period when infectious diseases, vaccine preventable infectious diseases are going back. We have measles outbreak, that it was mentioned already in European countries. Let's say 10 years ago, we had just 2 cases of measles per year. Recently, we have 600 cases because we have huge dropout in immunization, in spite of the fact that vaccination is mandatory in the Czech Republic. So we should think about that. And this started with Andrew Wakefield in UK, and afterwards, huge dropout in UK, going back to the situation. So this is quite important.
So that kind of brings me then to, why would somebody spread this false news? I mean, Cyril, back to you. What is the motivation behind vaccine hesitancy?
That's a good question. And
I mean, is it political or is it economic? This is actually a question from
one of the area where probably we need to do more
Shuja Malik.
That's probably where we need to do more research and understand their various motivations and beliefs. But it's, you have the different anti-movements, and that's one of the movements that we struggle to really understand all the underlying motivations. So it's where we're doing more research at the moment, because it really spreads, and we believe that unless we do that better research, we won't be able to best, address the concerns.
I mean, just to be clear here, for total disclosure, I mean, you work for Big Pharma, for a big pharmaceutical company.
That's one of
you make money out of vaccinations, so there will be people who will say, it's all about money, they're just trying to make money from us, but you're saying...
There is this, but these are not the most virulent.
Right.
There is some of this, which is, largely a population would, and a person would take a drug when sick, and would hesitate to the comment that was done by Mr. Minister, when I'm in good health, but I'm going to get a shot of a vaccine. It's a bit different as an approach. So this triggers lots of different, I would say, emotions and rational.
I want to come back to fake news, but before I do, if you have a question, just sort of raise your hand and I'll try either put it in on the Slido or raise your hand so I notice you. And I'm not short-sighted, I will notice you. Daniel, I want to come back to you. When we had the Salisbury attack in Britain last year in March, just to be clear what this was the first ever nerve agent attack in Britain, in a NATO country, where the British police and intelligence investigation concluded that 2 serving members of the GRU, Russian military intelligence, had come to Britain and basically to assassinate Sergei Skripal, who was a former Russian agent, or officer rather, a KGB officer, and a GRU officer. He'd served in Afghanistan. He was caught spying by Russia. He was imprisoned in 2010, and he was eventually swapped for some Russian spies who went back to Russia. But he was considered a traitor by the Kremlin, and essentially this was a failed assassination attempt. And then there was this extraordinary interview given by the 2 GRU officers back in Moscow, where they claimed that they'd come to Salisbury because they were interested in the cathedral. And when Notre Dame caught fire, somebody put out a cartoon saying, "You've got to feel sorry for those 2 GRU units. They love their cathedrals, they do." In Eastern Europe, Daniel, was it, how was the news of that taken? Because, you know, let's not forget, this was in living memory. This was a part of the Warsaw Pact. You're now a NATO country here in Slovakia. You're an EU member. You're considered by many to be part of the Western world. But how did that, did people just shrug when they got that news and just thought, oh, well, you know, maybe they didn't believe it. Maybe they believed the Kremlin version, which was, there were 29 different versions put out by the Kremlin, that this was Theresa May had done it. It was a rogue chemist. It was Porton Down who'd released it. How did the news go down here?
Yeah, I think it received quite considerable attention in the media, because obviously it was such a shocking attack, and the use of the nerve agent indeed is unprecedented in modern times in a member of NATO country. Nevertheless, I think the disinformation campaign, which was initiated right after the attack itself, succeeded to a certain extent to let's say, muddy the water. They spread so many different theories, as you said, 29 of them, or maybe even more since then, that, well, maybe it was a false flag operation, or it was someone else, or maybe the British government itself did it on purpose, which is obviously a nonsense, but it served the purpose to sow confusion, to sow distrust. And this is one of the most used and most often used tactics by the Kremlin, is not to convince a particular audience of their version of the events. It's rather to muddy the waters, to confuse, to sow distrust. Well, there are so many truths, we do not really know who's telling the truth, everybody lies. And this campaign has succeeded to a certain extent, and also for domestic political reasons. Slovakia was one of the very few countries that didn't expel any Russian operatives from Slovakia as this part of a wider operation, or wider expulsion of Russian agents or diplomats from NATO allied countries.
Director General.
I have to say that paradoxically, Salisbury and Amesbury attacks with chemical weapons.
Sorry, what was the second one?
Amesbury.
Amesbury, yes, Amesbury. Sorry.
Amesbury.
So this was a town very close to Salisbury, where the chemicals were found.
Had a very positive effect, and I'm going to explain why. When I arrived in The Hague in 2014 as a Spanish ambassador and permanent representative to the Opcw, people were asking me, but what do you do in the Opcw? And where is the Opcw located? It's in The Hague. And where is in The Hague? Next to the Marriott. Now this round building there, but what do you do there? Educated people of an educated society, the Netherlands, one. after what happened in Salisbury, people in the Netherlands, the same people, are asking me very specific questions, because in the Netherlands, the newspapers published everything. And now, the challenge we had before of the need to outreach so that people are aware of the very dangerous chemicals that are in the market, now people know, and they want to know the details, very specific details about what happened and what can be the consequences, which paradoxically, this very sad, unacceptable attack in Salisbury had this good effect of outreaching to people and creating awareness.
I imagine your job and the job of the OPCW is pretty difficult here, because Britain has blamed Russia, but Russia is a member of the OPCW. So you can't come out publicly and say it was Russia that did it. How far can you go in something like this? What's the maximum you can say in terms of attributing blame or identifying the source of this attack?
The maximum I can say is very clear. The British government asked the organization to go to Salisbury immediately after the attack. And we sent what is called the TAVA, Technical Assistant Visit, of inspectors, top qualified, and they worked together with the British authorities. And the inspectors, the technical assistant visit, came to the same conclusions as the conclusions that were reached by the British lab, Porton Down, and the British police. The conclusions, not to blame, not to assign responsibility, but the conclusions that a certain chemical of the family of Novichok was used in Salisbury, and also the remains of that were in Amesbury, and it caused the death of one person. This is what we can say. We cannot attribute responsibility.
So Novichok, as I'm sure most of you here understand Slav languages a lot better than I do, but I believe it means newcomer. And there was, I remember at the time, a very senior member of the Czech government. Unfortunately, the minister has left from here, but I think, was it the president or the prime minister? The president was maintaining that actually Czech Republic produces Novichok in commercial quantities or in industrial quantities, but the intelligence of the Czech Republic said, no, 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 we only produce tiny amount for defensive purposes, for research. Is that correct, Daniel?
Yeah, it's correct, and this points to the corrosive impact of disinformation and fake news, because I believe this was exactly the purpose why the Czech president made such a statement, just to sow more confusion and just to support the Russian narrative on this whole case, that, well, it's not that the attack originated from Russia, but perhaps, you know, we have also our own supplies, and God knows how actually it all happened in Salisbury. There is also one interesting element, and maybe also other panelists want to comment on this, and that was the cyber attack against OPCW in a follow-up to the attack, which clearly shows how all those types of attacks within the hybrid threats are interconnected. So you have a use of chemical weapon, you have activities of intelligence services, and hacking or hacking attempt.
Could you just remind us what that cyber attack was, or maybe Director General could?
I think you are more qualified to speak about this.
The OPCW has been victim of more than cyber attack. With those cyber attacks, the attacker wants to intimidate, wants to get confidential information, and wants to disrupt the IT system of the organization. What is very sad is that this organization was created 22 years ago. Nobody believed that an organization devoted to peace and security with an important humanitarian component was to be attacked. And we are vulnerable. And even the building is vulnerable. Why? Because times have changed. The world today is much more dangerous and complex than the one 22 years ago, when the convention was signed. We are adopting measures, and we are protecting the system. But we have not only been attacked through the cyber system, so to the IT system. We are attacked with misinformation, with proxies that produced reports, to undermine the official reports of the fact-finding mission about investigations in Syria. And I ask you, civil society, to believe in what we do. We work for the protection of the international community. We have top inspectors, we have top skills at the service of the international community. And anything you can do to help the organization to reinforce its legitimacy will be in the benefit of peace and security in the world.
This brings me on to a very specific thing. I know this is uncomfortable for you, Director General, but there was an article in The Independent, which I'm sure you know, written by somebody called Robert Fisk, which was claiming that the OPCW had hidden a version of news about Syria that it didn't agree with. Was that an example in your mind of fake news, that article, or was he right?
Not exactly. This article refers to a report, a document to speak precisely, produced by a staff member of the organization. When we have an investigation in connection, for instance, with an alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria, a team of investigators go there. It's called the fact-finding mission. And they get samples, they interview witnesses, they have conversations with the doctors, and everybody cooperates. They come back with all the information, they analyze the samples in the lab we have, but in other labs in the world recognized by the organization. And there are debates. And all the information given by any inspectors is considered. But sometimes it is not fit to the conclusion. This information was considered and it was analyzed. It was part of the investigation, and this information is going to be given. It has already been given to the investigation identification team in charge of attributing responsibilities, because this information you refer to is more focusing, is more targeted to establish responsibilities that to focus to the facts.
Now, I fear we may have stunned you into silence by the incredible depth of knowledge of the panel here, but if anybody does have a question, do please put your hand up, because I haven't seen any hands go up yet. So now would be a very good time to put your hands up, otherwise we will carry on talking amongst ourselves, or put your questions in on Slido. There is a question here that I want to address, which is about internet regulation for you, John. And Dominic Mucha, I hope I pronounced that right, is saying, what do you mean by internet regulation? Wouldn't it just lead to more distrust amongst people?
I suppose that the challenge is there's two things in my world that I have is everybody has the same language. We talk the World Wide Web, which is the internet. You know, there is a global standard for it. So there is obviously countries that have their own regulatory requirement around how they regulate internet access, etc. What I was trying to make was that the balance of the innovation and the regulation has to be made. It's not over-regulating or under-regulating. It's, you know, it was interesting about the conversation about the heritage systems that were mentioned. Most organizations I work with systems that are 30, 20, 10, 5 years old, even 5 years old. If they're not constantly being maintained and looked after, if they're not constantly being managed, they are going to start losing against the current race of issues. You know, you talked about all of the malware releases. So, you know, as an industry, what we're doing as Oracle is developing technology that self-heals itself, self-patches itself. And actually, one of the themes that will come out in the future will be called AI-developed software, where machine develops the next generation of software. Because actually...
Sorry, who would write the algorithms for that?
Well, this is where it's interesting. I did a project in 2002 for the UK government electronic voting system. And it was the first time that an electronic voting system happened in the UK. And one of the things we had to do there was agree the auditability of it. Because obviously voting after banking or banking after voting is the most, at the moment, it's the most political times. It's one of the most key systems. To prove to the Election Commission that the cast of a vote in a omni-channel architecture, omni-channel is could be internet, could be phone, could be TV, that the person that cast it was the person that wanted to cast for that person. And we had to do a data trail of auditability. And in technology terms, you might be aware of this, it's called non-repudiation. It's proving a factual statement. This is what happened.
Sorry, can you just explain that? Non-repudiation?
Non-repudiation. So it's the ability to say, if I put it into layman's language, that if I voted for Frank, then basically that's the person that got my vote. And actually nothing in the middle changed, fake news, etc. Technology is emerging that deals with this. One of the ones that a lot of people are talking about is blockchain. Blockchain, the ability...
I'm going to stop you there because blockchain is a whole other issue. And
I'll stop.
Thanks. Cyril, a question for you.
Yeah.
And this is from James. No surname given, so we'll assume it's Bond. James asks, MSD is a manufacturer of vaccine against Ebola, the Ebola virus. In Congo, even though the horrible consequences of the disease became visible, there is still distrust. How do you explain that?
So the vaccines that we've developed against Ebola is still at an investigational level. So we're currently producing as much as we can to deal with and help Médecins Sans Frontières, WHO, and the local authorities to really deal with the crisis. And at the same time, we're advancing the registration file.
Sorry, I have to say, but Ebola's been around for a long time. I remember the first outbreak in the 90s.
Vaccines can take more than 10 years to be developed. I mean, it's not being developed over a very short time. I mean, the reasons there are fairly few actors in the vaccines field is the huge complexity of discovering, developing a vaccine. If you take one of our recent rotavirus, not so recent vaccines, you're talking about trials where you need 70,000 people to participate in the trials in order to demonstrate the efficacy and safety of your vaccine. So it's not as if you develop a vaccines in a few months or years, let alone the fact that when we manufacture vaccines, we have vaccines that we start up to 4 years before the vaccine is available in the pharmacy to manufacture it. So there's a huge complexity. So Ebola is a vaccine that is now being used and with obviously manufacturing as much as we can and ramping up for that specific crisis as we further pursue also the registration of the vaccines. I personally, and it's the first time that I hear that within the country there would be distrust, except that again, and this was well said earlier on by the minister, the vaccine doesn't show efficacy on all strains.
Have you ever seen, Cyril, an example anywhere in the world of somebody weaponizing a pathogen like Ebola or Marburg?
Not something that I'm competent in, in commenting, to be honest.
Director General, I know it's biological rather than chemical, but do you want to comment?
Biological, in the biological field, it's much more difficult to create a weapon than in the chemical field. Because it is something alive, it is difficult to preserve, it is difficult to disseminate in many aspects, but it is not my field. But when we compare them, it is more difficult, the biological than the chemical, for producing harm.
Right. John, if we imagine that there was this big international organization that self-regulated the internet, I can't see it ever happening, but how would that work?
Well, it would be a challenge, because the thing about the world we live in is, if you look at there was predictions in like 10 years ago that we'd have exabytes of data, and exabytes of data is a lot of data. So just, if you look it up on one of those famous websites, you'll see what it means by that.
It's what, like many gigas? Or?
It's many. It's like every single person in the planet time. It's like going to the moon and back, and moon to back, moon to back, moon to back. It's just relentless. We don't know the amount of data we're going to have in the future. I think predicting where we're going to have the connected devices, and there's a certain technology that's now appearing called IoT, Internet of Things, which is connecting technology to technology. The challenge is if you look at the threats of the future, and specifically what's going to happen, it will move to the edge. And what I mean by that, it will go from the center outwards. If you look at any threat scenario, what happens is it has to get to a point where it's used in a sizable amount of technology to be worth something to go after. It could be political disruption, it could be fake news, it could be monetary benefit, ransomware, etc. No one will find a vulnerability and advertise it or even use it until it has some worth. So one of the things that we have to do is develop technology that spots the trends. You know, I ran another competition I was involved in, was one in the US called OpenHack back in the early zeros. And this is a competition where a vendor provides software to someone to go and actually try and penetrate it. What I noticed from the research, the attack techniques were pretty identical. When I looked at the data, I had basically 170 plus countries tried to penetrate it. So I had the entire landscape of the UK at the time. And I worked out, using certain modeling techniques, that actually the fundamental attack patterns all originated from a small number, but they morphed out. They morphed out to different themes and different contexts. I think what we need to have is a balance between privacy, because that's another king. If you regulate, it means you audit. Audit means you have privacy issues. And also you need to be conscious. It's looking for those patterns. If the patterns are you seeing are classified as a threat, then those are the ones we've got to deal with.
So, sorry to interrupt you. Connected with that, 2 years ago I interviewed the previous Director General of MI5, the security service in Britain. It's kind of like a Ministry of Domestic Intelligence. And I asked him, what did he see as the biggest threat? I said, what's coming down the tracks? What worries you? Kind of like the question I opened this session with. And he said, without hesitation, IoT, Internet of Things. These are things like wiring up your house so that you can phone in to turn on the lights from several miles away, kilometers away. Why? He said, I asked him, he said, because that provides a vulnerability for organized criminals to exploit. Now, it could be as simple as finding out your pattern of life, working out when you're at home, when you're not, when is the best time to break into your home, that you're not going to be there. But it's also a threat of data theft, of identity fraud. Way back, years ago, about 15 years ago, we were a victim, our family, of identity fraud. Somebody went through our litter bins, they got hold of an envelope with our address on it, and they then opened an account, a bank account, using our previous address as their current address and our present address as their former address. A certain British bank allowed them to open this account, and they took out £15,000. We didn't have to pay it because it was investigated by the fraud department of that bank, and we didn't lose any money. But it was pretty scary to realize that somebody had gone through our bins. That's low-tech ID theft. John, I wonder if you can give us an example of the more kind of contemporary ID theft and it happens now.
There's quite an interesting one at the moment that is around that is people having their cars stolen through the electronic key. So if you're not aware that there was a spate where people copy the digital signature of the key, and a digital signature is an access code, and basically people were having to put them into like tins. One of my colleagues said, well, put it into a bean tin because it stops allowing people to capture the device. Because the connected world we live in is, I was talking to students recently about the deviceless society, and they said, what do you mean? We've all got devices. But what I mean by that is the device is now hidden from us in a lot of cases. I have a heating system at home, and the heating system I have will barometer when a person is in the house. Back to that point, well, if you know the temperature of the house goes up, it means there will be a person there. If the temperature is going down, probably means there's not a person there. Also, if you look at electric gates, people can actually access electric gates because you don't update your electric gate that often. So there's many examples.
Okay, we've got a question here, going back to Cyril, actually. You mentioned about the huge number of people involved in trials, 70,000. And this is from Kate. out of those 70,000 trials, in how many cases can the vaccine fail in order to get approved? Or does it have to work 100%?
So, vaccines have multiple strains. So they work 100% on the strains that they've been developed for. So if you take let me take vaccines that, like the HPV vaccines, human papillomavirus, you have multiple type of viruses, and our vaccines act on 9 of them. So obviously not on the other ones, but on these 9, it's 100% effective.
Okay, in the very short time remaining, I'm going to be very unfair because with no notice, I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm going to pick you at random, not in order, to keep you on your toes. I'm going to ask each of you to give me one short sentence or short paragraph on how you would like, what you would like to see introduced to make the world a safer place in your area. And obviously, I'm going to start with Director General Gonzalez.
As I'm a lawyer, I would like to be seen as someone that convinces the member states to enact legislation to fight the crime in this field of chemical weapons. 38 countries of 193 members have not enacted any legislation in 22 years' time, which means that the political parties, the governments, the politicians have a big responsibility. And we cooperate with them, we help them, but sometimes we are successful and sometimes we are not successful. I would like very much to be seen as the one that promotes national legislation in the member states so that we have the instruments, the police, the judges have the instruments to prosecute the crime in the chemical field.
I think we all wish you good luck in that. Cyril, what would your wish be?
What I would say is fake news will continue, so that we are sure of. What I would like to see is both politicians and scientific experts to really be much more vocal on social media, using the same platforms as the anti-vax are using to really put the facts and share, the right policies and facts with citizens. In each and every country that we've seen this happen, we've seen very significant increases in vaccination because citizens do listen to leaders. So that's really important.
John?
I think mine is going back to the basics of explaining the importance of your personal data at the early education stage and actually working with industry.
Sorry, explaining to who?
To students, to literally children. We talk about sex education. We should talk about digital education beyond just technology, just based on simple techniques to protect yourself for the future.
Daniel, final word.
Point. On one hand, I would like to see a wholehearted effort by the social media giants to address this growing threat to our democratic societies. So far what we have seen is nowhere nearly enough to stop the erosion of trust of people. And on the other hand, I would like to see a much more concerted effort by the governments to increase resilience of national authorities, but society as such, to these new types of threats attacking people's minds through manipulation of information and on the internet predominantly.
Wonderful. So in a short moment, a former colleague of mine, Nick Gowing, a former presenter at BBC, is going to tell you about the arrangements for this evening's festivities. But before that, if you could join me in giving a big thank you to our esteemed panel here.
Thank you, Frank, but I come with no threats, no existential threats. Just some basic information, which I suppose I used to do as a television presenter, just giving you not fake news, but real news. I'm going to just give an impression. I think a lot of you are here to try to work out how to navigate through disruption, and you're still trying to work out not how to navigate, but what the waters are ahead. I've sensed a degree of listening rather than actually contributing. So what I'd like to do, and I've been asked to do tomorrow morning at 8:30, is try and bring together some of the threads that we've begun to see today, so you might feel more emboldened to thrive in this time of disruption, because that's what you're all here for, not to be disabled, but to thrive. So please come with your ideas at 8:30. Yes, it is 8:30, but I have to tell you that at 10 to 9, in this room, in the same place, there will be the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Todd Waters, who's only been in the job for less than 30 days. It's his first public appearance. So it'll be extraordinarily full. I'm just the warm-up act. He's going to tell you what life is really like, what the threats of disruption really are from places further east. So please come at 8:30, because if you come at 10 to 9, you're too late. And come with ideas, but I'll try and sum up some of the strands that have been detected by me and other members of the team. Now, the most basic part of it, which is this, buses. This is my role in life now. The buses will leave out from outside this hotel to the cocktail at 7 o'clock. And you will be able to get back on a bus. The buses will start returning at 9:20. They will run every 20 minutes until 11:40. And if you get on the 11:40 bus, I'll still expect to see you back here by 8:30 in the morning. Is that a deal? It is, I say, an existential threat. Frank and everyone else, thank you very much indeed, and enjoy this evening.